For 6 lost years, the former Navy SEAL survived by believing he would reach his wife again. Now he drove an aging pickup through falling snow toward their remote mountain village. Through the windshield, he suddenly saw a familiar German shepherd stumbling beside the frozen road. The dog was older, painfully thin, and staring at him with frightened, searching eyes. But when they reached home, the porch was dark, the windows boarded, and his wife was gone. What had happened while he was missing? And why did the old dog fear the company trying to control the road his wife had protected? Where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts, and please like and subscribe as we work toward welcoming our first 1,000 subscribers. The old pickup climbed toward Pine Glass, a remote mountain village hidden among the snow-covered ridges of the American Northwest. Bennett Rourke, a 51-year-old former Navy SEAL, kept both hands on the steering wheel as the narrow road curved between tall pine trees. The truck pulled to the right whenever its tires crossed packed ice. Its heater coughed lukewarm air through cracked vents, and something beneath the floor rattled whenever Bennett pressed the accelerator. None of that mattered. The road was taking him home. Morning sunlight spread across the mountain in a clean winter brightness. Snow covered the roofs below, softened the split rail fences, and rested heavily on the dark branches of the forest. From the upper road, Pine Glass looked smaller than Bennett remembered, almost untouched by the 6 years he had been gone. He knew that could not be true. His own reflection in the rearview mirror proved it. Bennett's face had grown leaner during the years of captivity. His cheekbones were sharper, and his once straight nose bent slightly from an old break that had never healed properly. Long brown hair, heavily streaked with silver, fell in 2 uneven sections around his forehead and brushed the collar of his faded camouflage shirt. A thick salt and pepper stubble covered his jaw. His left shoulder sat lower than his right. Doctors had told him it might always remain that way. The military surplus clothing he wore had no rank, patches, or name stitched above the pockets. It was simply warm, durable, and inexpensive. Bennett did not want to arrive in Pine Glass dressed as the man he had been before the mission. He wanted Celia Rourke, his wife of 24 years, to see the man who had found his way back. The thought tightened beneath his ribs. Nearly 6 years earlier, Bennett had joined a dangerous maritime evacuation operation far from American waters. The vessel carrying his team had been destroyed during severe weather. The final men recovered from the accident believed Bennett had been swept from the deck and lost in the sea. No body had ever been found. No court had legally declared him dead. But after years without a message, his fellow servicemen, his neighbors, and almost everyone in Pine Glass had accepted that Bennett Rourke would never return. They had been wrong. Bennett had survived with serious injuries. He had been held for years under an identity his captors could not confirm. By the time he was released during a prisoner exchange, his name existed only in sealed reports and fading memories. He had spent nearly 4 months in a military hospital, undergoing surgery, rehabilitation, and identity verification before he was strong enough to travel alone. Now only a few miles separated him from the house where Celia should be waiting. Bennett eased his foot from the accelerator. Something was moving along the snowy shoulder ahead. At first, he mistook it for a broken branch dragging in the wind. Then the shape lifted its head. It was a large dog. The animal walked close to the drainage ditch, placing each paw carefully on the frozen ground. Snow had gathered between its toes. Its rear legs moved stiffly, and its body looked too narrow beneath a heavy black and gold coat. Bennett slowed the truck. The dog turned toward him. His breath stopped before the vehicle did. It was Briar, the 11-year-old female German shepherd that Bennett and Celia had raised together since she was a young dog. Briar. Her name left his mouth in a whisper. The black saddle across Briar's back had faded with age, and silver fur now covered her muzzle. 2 pale marks above her eyes gave her the sorrowful expression of an old soul. Her left ear leaned slightly outward. On the edge of her right ear, Bennett could still see the small, triangular notch she had earned, while forcing her way through a wire fence years earlier. Briar had once raced down this road whenever she heard his engine. Now she stood beneath a pine tree and stared at him without moving. Bennett pulled onto the shoulder and shut off the truck. Silence settled over the road. He opened the driver's door slowly. Briar lowered her head and shifted her weight backward. "It's all right," Bennett said. The dog watched him with dark amber eyes. Bennett stepped into the snow. Pain moved through his damaged shoulder, but he did not let it change his pace. He walked several feet away from the truck, then lowered himself carefully onto one knee. The cold reached through his trousers at once. "Briar," he said again. "It's me." One of her ears moved at the sound of his voice. Bennett remembered Briar standing at the kitchen window beside Celia. He remembered the dog hearing his truck before it reached the lower bend. He remembered Celia laughing as Briar raced from the porch, unable to decide whether to greet him or turn back for her. That picture had lived inside Bennett through years when he could not see the sky. He removed one glove and placed his bare hand against the packed snow. Briar took a single step, then another. Her left rear leg dragged slightly before she corrected it. She stopped several feet away and raised her nose, studying the scent of his skin, his clothing, and all the lost time between them. Bennett remained still. At last, Briar approached and touched her cold nose to his fingers. Something inside him gave way. The old dog sniffed once more. Then she pressed her silvered muzzle into his palm. Bennett closed his hand gently along the side of her face. "Good girl," he whispered. Briar trembled against him. Bennett could not tell whether the shaking came from cold, exhaustion, or recognition. He rested his forehead against the top of her head. "You waited too." For one brief moment, Briar leaned her weight into him. Then she turned and looked down the road toward the village. Bennett followed her gaze. The reunion should have brought relief. Instead, it gave him the first clear warning that something was wrong. Briar was too thin. Ice clung to the fur around her paws. Her hind legs were stiff with age and strain. More troubling was the way she watched the road behind them, not like a dog that had wandered from home, but like one expecting something to follow. Bennett opened the passenger door and lifted her carefully into the truck. She felt far lighter than she should have. For the next mile, Briar watched Bennett more than the scenery. Her eyes moved from his hands to his face, as though she still expected him to disappear. Then, a heavy diesel engine sounded behind them. A large orange snowplow rounded the bend. Briar immediately dropped low against the passenger seat. Her breathing became quick and shallow. Bennett looked into the mirror. The vehicle belonged to Summit Passage, the private company that handled much of Pine Glass's snow removal, fuel delivery, and non-emergency winter transportation. The snowplow did not chase them or come unusually close. It simply passed on a wider stretch of road and continued downhill. But Briar remained pressed against the seat long after it disappeared. Bennett held one hand near her without forcing contact. "What happened to you, girl?" Briar kept staring at the road behind them. The final hill rose ahead. Bennett had imagined this turn during every season of his absence. In his mind, the porch lamp was always burning. Celia stood in the doorway, wearing her dark green cardigan. Briar raced across the yard, then turned back to make sure Celia was following. Bennett guided the truck around the last bend. The house still stood on the snowy slope, but the home he remembered was gone. Several windows had been partly covered with weathered boards. Snow lay untouched across the porch steps. The wooden flower boxes Celia filled every spring hung empty beneath the front windows. The porch lamp had been removed, leaving a pale mark on the siding. Bennett stopped near the gate. A white notice had been fastened to the fence post beneath a clear plastic cover. He stepped out and read it. The document stated that Summit Passage had filed a disputed claim against the property for unpaid medical transportation, snow service, and fuel delivery charges. Bennett read the notice twice. The house had belonged to him and Celia together. Because he had never been declared legally dead, Celia could not have transferred the entire property without his signature. Yet someone had placed a legal burden against their home. Behind him, Briar made a low, uncertain sound. She had climbed down from the truck, but had not approached the porch. She stood in the middle of the yard, staring at the darkened house with her head lowered. Before Bennett could call her, a neighboring door opened across the slope. Mabel Cross, Bennett and Celia's 66-year-old neighbor and Pine Glass's retired rural mail carrier, came carefully down the snowy path. She wore a brick-red quilted coat, a cream-knit cap, and an old brown postal bag across her body. Bennett recognized her immediately. Mabel had delivered mail through Pine Glass for more than 30 years. She knew every road, every family, and which houses needed checking when smoke stopped rising from a chimney. She stopped several feet from Bennett. Her pale blue eyes moved over his long hair, his uneven shoulders, and the scars across his hands. "You're alive," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." Mabel looked toward Briar. Relief softened her face for only a moment. "I've been searching for her for 3 days. I found her on the upper road. One of the Summit Passage trucks stopped near my property," Mabel said. Briar panicked and forced her way through the gate before I could reach her. She hasn't trusted those vehicles for some time. Bennett looked at the house. "Where's Celia?" Mabel closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she did not offer him a hand or soften the truth. "Celia died nearly 5 months ago." The mountain seemed to lose every sound. Bennett heard the words. He understood each one separately. Together, they refused to make sense. Mabel continued because someone had to. Her lungs had been failing for a long time. She stayed in the house as long as she could. I helped her. Other people did too. Bennett stared at the dark windows. "I was recovered 4 months ago. I know when they confirmed your identity. She was already gone." 3 weeks, Mabel said quietly. She had been gone 3 weeks. Bennett had known those dates inside the hospital. Officials had explained them carefully, using calm voices and printed reports. But a date in a guarded room was not the same as standing outside the home where his wife should have been. "She waited for you," Mabel said. "Right to the end." Bennett's thumb moved over the pale mark around his left ring finger. Briar came slowly to his side and pressed her shoulder against his leg. Mabel watched the old dog. "Briar stayed with me after the funeral, but she kept coming back here. Celia used to stand near the road whenever the weather was clear. Briar continued doing the same thing." Bennett rested one hand on the dog's back. He had survived nearly 6 years to return after his wife's funeral. The realization did not arrive as tears. It arrived as an emptiness so complete that even breathing felt unnecessary. Mabel unlocked the house with the key Celia had given her. Bennett carried in a blanket for Briar, lit the old stove, and sat in the cold living room without removing his coat. Darkness came early over Pine Glass. Shortly after 7, headlights crossed the front window. Briar lifted her head. A vehicle stopped outside. The knock at the door was controlled and polite. Warren Cade, the 55-year-old owner of Summit Passage, stood on the porch holding a leather folder. He was lean, clean-shaven, and carefully dressed in a charcoal wool coat over a black turtleneck. His dark hair was combed back, with silver at both temples. Even his brown leather boots looked untouched by the snow. Warren offered his condolences in a measured voice. Then he placed the folder on Celia's kitchen table. He explained that Summit Passage did not own the Rourke house. The company had only filed a claim based on services provided during Celia's illness. Challenging the claim, he warned, could become expensive and slow. "There may be a simpler solution," Warren said. He opened the folder and turned a document toward Bennett. Summit Passage would cancel the claimed debt if Bennett granted the company permanent access through the Rourke property. Warren removed a silver pen from his coat and placed it beside the signature line. Bennett looked at the agreement. "No." Warren remained calm. "You should read the entire document before deciding." "I did. You have been away a long time, Mr. Rourke. Pineglass has changed." Bennett pushed the unsigned paper back across the table. "So have I." For the first time, Warren's expression tightened. He closed the folder and adjusted his black scarf. "My offer will remain available for a short time." Bennett opened the front door. Warren stepped into the snow without another word. Outside, the engine of his vehicle started. Briar did not bark. The old German shepherd backed into the corner beside the stove, lowered her body, and stared at the door until the sound of the engine disappeared down the mountain. Bennett remained beside Celia's kitchen table. One hand rested on the unsigned agreement. The other hung close to Briar, waiting for her to approach when she felt safe. He had returned expecting to find the life he had lost. Instead, he had found an empty house, a frightened old dog, and a man who had prepared papers for the road through Celia's home before Bennett ever reached the mountain. Mabel Cross arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying a thermos, a folded wool blanket, and a shovel. Bennett Rourke was already awake. He had spent most of the night in the living room of the old Rourke house, seated near the iron stove while Briar slept on the blanket beside him. The 11-year-old German shepherd had rested in short stretches, waking whenever wind pressed against the windows or an engine moved along the lower road. Bennett had not gone upstairs. The bedroom at the end of the hall still belonged too completely to Celia. Mabel set the thermos on the kitchen table. "I brought coffee," she said, "and the shovel is for the cemetery path." Bennett looked toward the windows. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, softening the yard and covering the tire marks left by Warren Cade's vehicle. "You're taking me to her?" "Yes." Mabel did not say. Grave. She did not need to. Bennett pulled on his dark green parka over the faded camouflage shirt. Briar rose slowly from the blanket. Her left rear leg remained stiff for the first few steps, but she followed him toward the door. "She doesn't have to come," Bennett said. "She'll decide that herself." Mabel opened the door. Briar stepped into the snow. The small hillside cemetery above Pineglass sat beyond the village church, on a quiet slope, surrounded by tall spruce and pine. It held fewer than 100 graves, most belonging to families who had lived on the mountain for generations. Bennett walked beside Mabel along the narrow path. Briar followed several paces behind, stopping often to sniff the snow or rest one hind leg. No one spoke until they reached an old pine tree near the upper fence. Celia Rourke's grave lay beneath it. The stone was simple gray granite. Snow filled the shallow letters of her name. Beneath the dates of her birth and death was one sentence. She kept the road home open for everyone. Bennett stood without moving. He read the words once, then again. "She chose that?" he asked. Mabel shook her head. Celia wrote it on a piece of paper before she went into the county clinic for the last time. She told me that if she didn't come back, those were the words she wanted. Bennett looked down the mountain. From the cemetery, he could see part of the narrow road entering Pineglass. In winter, it appeared as a pale line between dark trees. She still believed I would come home. She did. His eyes returned to the inscription. "That's what this means." Mabel rested both hands on the handle of the shovel. "That is only half of what it means." The answer made Bennett turn. Mabel's expression held no cruelty. It held the steady patience of someone who had carried a truth long enough to know it could not be delivered all at once. "During the first few years," she said, "Celia watched that road for you. Every clear afternoon, she stood near the front gate with Briar. People stopped asking her why." Bennett looked at the old dog. Briar had settled near the stone, not facing the grave but facing the road below. Mabel continued. "Then Celia's breathing got worse. She could not work regular hours anymore. She started helping people from the house instead." "What kind of help?" "Phone calls at first, ordering medicine, finding someone with a truck when a fuel delivery was late, checking which roads were to open after a storm." Mabel brushed snow from the edge of the headstone with one gloved hand. "There are people in Pine Glass who do fine in summer and become almost invisible in winter." Celia knew who lived alone. She knew who needed oxygen, who had a generator that could not run through the night, and who would rather freeze than admit they could not afford another delivery fee. Bennett listened without interrupting. He had carried one image of his wife through captivity. Celia at the porch, warm light behind her, waiting for him. That woman had been real. But she had not remained frozen in that doorway. "When did Summit Passage become involved?" he asked, long before Celia became ill. Summit Passage, the private snow removal and fuel delivery company owned by Warren Cade, held a county contract to clear several secondary roads around Pine Glass. The company also sold heating fuel, repaired generators, and provided non-emergency transport to the nearest medical clinic. It did not control the county rescue service. It did not own the public roads. But Pine Glass was far from the county center, and few businesses had vehicles powerful enough to operate safely on the mountain during heavy snow. That gave Warren more influence than any contract stated. He understood dependence, Mabel said. Better than most people understand kindness. The company charged extra fees when deliveries were made during storms. Some of those charges were reasonable. Others changed after the work was completed. Residents who could not pay were offered new agreements secured by sheds, small parcels of land, or future access rights. Why didn't the county stop it? Because most of the complaints looked separate. One disputed bill. One late delivery. One old man who signed something he did not fully understand. People were embarrassed, and they still needed Warren's trucks the following week. Mabel looked toward the village below. That is how control grows in a small place, not always through threats, sometimes through the fear that the next storm will come before anyone believes you. Bennett studied the road again. The Rourke house stood near the final section of an old public route that crossed the mountain shoulder. The county had stopped maintaining most of it years earlier, but the route still existed in public records as an emergency passage. Warren had been purchasing land beyond that road for a private winter resort. Without access through the Rourke property, his planned route remained longer, steeper, and more expensive. He wanted Celia's signature, Bennett said, for years. Mabel told him that Warren first approached Celia with an ordinary purchase offer. She refused. Later, as her illness progressed and bills increased, the offers changed. Warren proposed paying for medical treatment and canceling several service charges if Celia granted Summit Passage permanent access through the property. She still said no, Mabel said, even when she was sick. Especially then. Bennett's jaw tightened. That sounds like her. It does, Mabel replied. But do not turn her into a saint because she is gone. The words struck harder than Bennett expected. Mabel met his eyes. Celia hid how sick she was. She missed appointments. She refused help until people had to leave food on the porch. I told her to sell a small piece of land and use the money for treatment. What did she say? She said if Warren could force her to sell by making illness expensive, he would do the same thing to everyone else. Mabel's voice softened. She was brave. She was also stubborn enough to make loving her difficult. Bennett looked at Celia's name on the stone. That, too, sounded like her. He knelt and pressed his bare fingertips to the cold granite. There were things he wanted to say, but every sentence felt too small. I came back. I was alive. I am sorry. None of them could cross the distance between his hand and the earth beneath it. Briar rose and came closer. The old German shepherd placed one paw near the base of the grave, then looked toward Bennett. He did not mistake it for a message. Briar was cold. Her leg hurt. She had learned to remain near people who were hurting. For that moment, it was enough. They started down the cemetery path near midday. A diesel engine grew louder on the road below. An orange Summit Passage snowplow came around the bend beside the church. Its front blade pushed a shallow wave of powder from the pavement. Briar stopped. Her ears flattened. She moved directly against Bennett's leg and lowered her body. The reaction was immediate, but controlled. She did not bark or pull away. She simply pressed close enough that Bennett could feel her trembling through his trousers. He placed his hand on her shoulder. The snowplow continued past without slowing. Mabel watched the vehicle disappear. "She does not react that way to the county trucks," Bennett said. "No. Or to my pickup?" "No. Only Summit Passage? As far as I have seen." Bennett looked at the old dog. Briar's eyes remained fixed on the road even after the engine faded. Mabel did not guess at the reason, and Bennett did not ask her to. A dog's fear could identify a pattern. It could not explain one. By early afternoon, they were back at the Rourke house. Mabel left Bennett the keys and returned to her own home. Briar settled near the stove while Bennett began moving through the rooms. He did not search for a hidden confession or some perfect answer Celia had left behind. He opened curtains, checked pipes, carried spoiled food from the pantry, and made a list of repairs. The house revealed her final months through ordinary objects. An empty oxygen cylinder stood beside a chair near the front window. Prescription bottles had been arranged by day in a wooden tray. A wool shawl lay folded over the back of the chair, within reach of a woman who had grown cold easily. In the kitchen cupboard, Bennett found 2 ceramic cups placed side by side. One was pale blue and chipped along the handle. Celia had used it every morning. The other was Bennett's dark green cup. It had been washed and returned to the shelf as though he might need it the next day. He held it for a long time. Then he placed it back exactly where he had found it. Near the window stood a narrow writing desk Celia had bought from a church sale. The top drawer contained stamps, appointment cards, batteries, and carefully folded receipts. Bennett sorted the papers into small stacks. Most were ordinary household records. Then he found an invoice from Summit Passage. The first page documented a medical transport from the Rourke house to the county clinic during a winter storm. The listed date was 11 months before Celia died. At the bottom was her signature. Bennett recognized the slight upward turn in the final letter of her last name. Celia had signed birthday cards, tax returns, and notes in his lunch bag with the same movement. The page number at the bottom read, "Page 1 of 1. Behind it, however, a second document had been attached with a metal staple. The paper felt newer. It was titled, "Secured Service Addendum." The addendum stated that if the transportation and related emergency charges remained unpaid, Celia granted Summit Passage a financial interest in the access road crossing the Rourke property. A notary seal appeared near the bottom. Celia's signature did not. Instead, one line declared that her signature on the original invoice applied to every attached condition. Bennett laid both pages side by side. The typefaces were different. The margins did not align. The staple holes in the invoice showed that something else had once been fastened in a slightly different position. None of that proved a crime, but it gave him something stronger than anger. It gave him a question that could be tested. Bennett carried the documents to the kitchen table, where Warren had placed the agreement the night before. Briar raised her head from the blanket. "The first page is hers," Bennett said. The old dog watched him. "The second one may not be." He did not promise Briar that he would punish anyone. He did not tell Celia's empty chair that he would fix everything. He placed the invoice and the addendum inside a clean folder. Until that afternoon, Bennett had believed he was protecting the house where Celia had waited for him. Now he understood that the property guarded something larger, the last public route Warren had not yet brought under his control. Bennett looked toward the snow-covered road beyond the window. He no longer wanted only to know what had happened to his home. He wanted to know how one ride to a medical clinic had been turned into a claim on the road Celia had refused to surrender. By mid-morning, Bennett Rourke had already learned that Pine Glass spoke differently when Briar walked beside him. The old German shepherd could not move quickly. Her left rear leg needed several steps to loosen, and every few blocks she stopped to rest beneath an awning or beside a fence warmed by the sun. Bennett adjusted his pace to hers. That small change kept him from crossing the village like a man searching for one answer. It made him notice who avoided the orange Summit Passage trucks, which homes had empty fuel drums beside their porches, and how conversations changed whenever Warren Cade's company was mentioned. The first person willing to show Bennett a bill was Edith Lyle, a 72-year-old widow who lived alone in a cedar-sided cottage near the lower road. Edith did not invite him inside at first. She stood in the doorway wearing a thick lavender sweater and held the folded invoice against her chest. "I paid what they quoted," she said. Then another bill came. How much more? Nearly 3 times. Bennett did not reach for the paper. "May I see it?" Edith hesitated. Briar sat beside Bennett's boot, her silvered muzzle lifted toward the woman. The widow looked down at the dog. "Celia used to bring her here." Briar's tail touched the snow once. That was enough. Edith handed Bennett the invoice. The first amount covered a routine heating fuel delivery. 2 added charges were listed beneath it: hazardous road access and emergency equipment deployment. "The road was clear that day," Edith said. "I remember because I swept the porch before the truck came." "Did you dispute it?" "I called." "What did they say?" "That the driver's report was final, and when you refused to pay." Edith's fingers tightened around the edge of her sweater. "They offered a payment plan secured by the strip of land behind my house." Bennett returned the invoice carefully. "Did you sign?" "No, but I stopped calling." "Why?" "Because my fuel tank still empties in winter." There was no drama in her answer. That made it harder to dismiss. Bennett had expected fear. What he found was dependence dressed as practicality. He thanked Edith and moved on. At the Blue Lantern Cafe, a small family restaurant beside Pine Glass's village square, Bennett met the owner, a broad-shouldered woman named Ruth Danner. Ruth had allowed Summit Passage to place a temporary generator behind the building during a power outage 2 winters earlier. The agreement was supposed to last 10 days. Months later, Warren's company claimed the contract also included long-term vehicle access through the alley behind the cafe. "I signed the first page," Ruth said, as she wiped down the counter. "The rest came later." "Did you keep a copy?" "A photograph on my phone. Celia made me take it before I signed." That was the first time Bennett heard Celia's name spoken, as part of a habit rather than a memory. Ruth unlocked her phone and showed him the image. The photographed document contained 1 page. The version later sent by Summit Passage contained 3. "Why didn't you take it to the county?" Bennett asked. Ruth gave him a tired look. "I run a cafe. Warren has trucks, attorneys, and contracts with people who return his calls." Bennett looked around the room. 3 customers sat at separate tables. All of them were listening without appearing to listen. "You could speak together," he said. Ruth stopped wiping the counter. "That is easy to say when you have just come home." The words were not cruel. They were accurate. Bennett had spent years surviving places where danger announced itself clearly. Pine Glass had learned to survive something quieter. No single bill looked large enough to justify a fight. No single delay looked deliberate. No single frightened resident believed their story would matter. He had come back ready to identify an enemy, The village needed him to understand the system first. Briar shifted beside him and lowered herself to the floor. Bennett noticed the stiffness in her hind leg. "We should go," he said. Ruth came around the counter with a small bowl of water. "You always listen to the dog?" "Not always." "You should." Bennett almost smiled. Outside, he shortened their route. They passed a weathered workshop that no longer belonged to the man who had built it. Mabel had told Bennett the former owner lost the building after several disputed snow removal charges became a secured debt. No one had forced the man from the property in one dramatic moment. He had signed one extension, then another. By the time he understood what the paperwork allowed, legal costs were already beyond what he could pay. Bennett stood across the road from the locked workshop. The pattern was becoming clearer. Warren did not take property by appearing at the door and demanding keys. Summit Passage created confusion, increased pressure, and offered relief in exchange for access or security. People signed because the next delivery, the next storm, or the next medical appointment felt more urgent than a paragraph written in small print. Briar nudged Bennett's knee. He looked down. The dog was not watching the workshop. She was looking toward a large metal building near the edge of the village. A faded sign above the doors read, "Pine Glass Cooperative Garage," the shared repair building where residents stored community equipment. Briar began walking toward it. The garage door stood partly open. A metallic tapping came from inside, followed by a man's voice. "If you are here to offer advice, put it on the shelf. I already have too much." Cal Mercer, Pine Glass's 58-year-old year-round mechanic, emerged from beneath the frame of an old snow-clearing vehicle. Cal was shorter than Bennett and built solidly through the chest and forearms. His head was nearly bald, and a thick gray mustache covered his upper lip. Square-framed glasses sat low on his nose. A yellow carpenter's pencil rested behind one ear. He wiped his hands on a dark blue shop cloth. "You are Bennett Rourke." "And you are Cal Mercer. Celia said you were taller. She remembered me younger." Cal looked at Briar. The mechanic's guarded expression softened. "There you are, old lady." Briar crossed the concrete floor and settled beside a workbench near the wall. She did not circle or search. She lay down in one exact place, rested her chin on her paws, and released a long breath. Cal watched her. That was her spot. Briar's? Both of theirs, depending on the day. Bennett looked toward the machine in the center of the garage. It was an old tracked snow vehicle purchased years earlier from the county equipment yard. One side panel had been removed. Part of the engine sat exposed, and the left track sagged against the floor. "Celia worked on this?" "She organized the people who knew how." Cal tapped the side panel twice with his knuckles. She could not rebuild a transmission, but she knew who had tools, who had time, and who could be trusted to show up. What was it for? A backup route. Fuel, medicine, food. Whatever the village needed when Summit Passage decided another contract mattered more. Bennett walked around the vehicle. How close was it to running? "Closer than it looks." Cal pointed toward the damaged track assembly. "We needed a replacement tension wheel and 2 smaller parts. Then Summit Passage bought the nearest regional supplier. Prices went up. Orders from Pine Glass started disappearing." "Can that be proved?" Cal gave him a direct look. "I repair machines. I do not prove motives." Bennett accepted this boundary. "When did the work stop?" "When Celia became too sick to come here." The answer landed differently from the objects Bennett had found in the house. Celia's empty oxygen tank showed what illness had taken from her. This broken machine showed what she had still been trying to build. Bennett glanced at Briar. The dog's eyes were closed. For the first time since he found her on the road, she looked completely at rest. "She remembered this place," he said. Of course she did. Celia brought her every week. Cal returned to his tools. "You came here asking about Warren?" "I came here because Briar did." That may be the better reason. Before Bennett could ask more, the garage telephone rang. Cal answered, listened, then held the receiver toward him. Blue Lantern Cafe. Warren Cade is asking whether you will meet him. Bennett looked at Briar. The dog remained asleep. I'll go. Warren was seated in a rear booth when Bennett returned to the cafe. The owner of Summit Passage wore a dark wool coat over a gray vest. A leather folder lay beside his coffee. He had chosen a table far enough from the counter to create privacy without appearing secretive. Bennett sat across from him. Warren opened the folder. I thought you should see exactly what was filed. He placed copies of the disputed property claim, the medical transport invoice, and the secured service addendum on the table. Bennett recognized the documents. Warren folded his hands. You seem to believe my company is claiming ownership of your home. It is claiming an interest in the road. A financial interest tied to unpaid services. My wife could not transfer the entire property. She did not. Warren's answer came without hesitation. Because Bennett had never been legally declared dead, the house remained jointly owned. Celia could not have transferred Bennett's share. Warren acknowledged that. Then he pointed to the addendum. Your wife retained an individual interest in the property. Summit Passage maintains that she used that interest to secure legitimate expenses incurred during her treatment. Maintains. That is what courts are for. The words were calm, almost friendly. Warren continued. If the claim is upheld, the matter could take years to resolve. There would be legal costs, title complications, and questions about the estate. And if I sign your agreement, the debt disappears. You keep the house. My company receives permanent access along the existing route. Bennett studied the man across from him. Warren did not need the whole property. He only needed the part that made the rest useful. You built the pressure before I came back, Bennett said. I managed an unresolved account. You prepared an access agreement for a man everyone believed was gone. Warren lifted his cup. I prepare for changing circumstances. Bennett stood. He left the papers on the table. Warren called after him. You should visit the county records office before you decide that suspicion is the same as proof. I intend to. The county records office, a small government building located 40 miles down the mountain, stayed open until 5. Bennett drove there alone while Briar rested with Mabel. A clerk reviewed the file and explained the legal position without taking sides. Summit Passage had filed a claim. A court had not approved it. The company did not own the house, the road, or any share of the land. But the filing could cloud the title, complicate refinancing, and become the basis of a lawsuit if left unanswered. To challenge it successfully, Bennett would need more than mismatched margins and suspicion. He needed evidence that the addendum had been altered, improperly certified, or attached to charges that were themselves invalid. Who submitted the original file? Bennett asked. The clerk checked the record. Summit Passage used an internal processing officer. Name? The clerk turned the screen toward him. Dean Hollis. The name meant nothing to Bennett. When he returned to Pineglass after dark, Mabel recognized it immediately. Dean Hollis was Warren's vehicle dispatcher and records coordinator, she said. He retired last year. Where does he live? Near the old relay station above the Eastern Ridge. I'll speak to him tomorrow. Mabel shook her head. You can try. Bennett looked toward the living room where Briar slept near the stove. What does that mean? It means Celia tried before you. Mabel pulled on her gloves. Dean knows how Summit Passage kept its records. He also knows what his own name is attached to. Will he talk? He does not even come into the village unless he has to. After Mabel left, Bennett returned to the cooperative garage. Cal was still working beneath a hanging lamp. Briar had resumed her place beside the bench, calm in a room filled with tools and unfinished work. Bennett stood before the old snow vehicle. Until that day, he had seen Warren's actions as a series of individual wrongs. Now he understood the design. A bill became a debt. A debt became a signature. A signature became a claim. By the time a person fought back, the paperwork had made surrender look cheaper than truth. Bennett rested one hand on the cold metal frame. The claim against his home was not yet ownership. It could still be challenged. But the man who might explain how the papers were created had already refused Celia, and was now hiding from the village whose records he had once controlled. The next morning, Bennett Rourke drove toward the eastern ridge to find Dean Hollis. Dean was the 62-year-old former vehicle dispatcher and records coordinator for Summit Passage, the private winter service company whose claim now burdened the Rourke property. According to Mabel Cross, Dean lived alone near an aging radio relay station above Pine Glass and avoided the village unless he needed supplies. Bennett never reached the house. As he passed the Pine Glass Cooperative Garage, he noticed an unfamiliar station wagon parked beside the building. The rear hatch stood open. Inside were 2 empty wooden tool cases and a coil of electrical cable. Bennett pulled over. Through the partly raised garage door, he heard Cal Mercer speaking. "You left these here almost 2 years. I know how long it has been." The second voice was thin, controlled, and tired. Bennett entered the shared repair garage. Cal, the village mechanic, stood beside a workbench with a wrench in one hand. Across from him was a tall, narrow-shouldered man wearing a brown-gray wool coat over a dark cardigan. His thinning ash-blonde hair had been combed carefully to one side, though the wind had lifted several strands. A small black notebook showed from his breast pocket. The stranger held a metal toolbox, but did not appear strong enough to enjoy carrying it. Cal looked from one man to the other. "Bennett, this is Dean Hollis." Dean's pale blue eyes moved to Bennett's face and stayed there for only a moment. "I know who he is." Bennett closed the garage door behind him, shutting out the wind. "I was on my way to see you." "That saves fuel," Dean said. He bent to lift another toolbox from beneath the bench. The keys attached to his belt struck one another with a nervous metallic sound. Bennett did not block his path. "I need to ask about a medical transport Summit Passage made for Celia." Dean's hand stopped on the toolbox handles. Cal set down his wrench. The garage became quiet except for the soft ticking of a space heater. "I don't work there anymore," Dean said. "You processed the file." "I processed thousands of files. This one placed a claim on my property." Dean straightened slowly. His shoulders remained slightly rounded, as though he had spent years trying to take up less room than the paperwork around him. "That is a legal question." "No, the legal question comes later. I want to know how many pages were in the record when you entered it." Dean's fingers found the edge of the black notebook in his pocket. He rubbed the cover with his thumb. Cal watched the movement, then walked toward the old community snow vehicle in the center of the garage. "I'll be over here," he said, not listening badly. Dean looked toward the door. Bennett could have pressed harder. Years earlier, he would have closed the distance and let silence do the work. But Pine Glass wasn't an interrogation room, and Dean was not an enemy combatant. He was a frightened man carrying part of the truth and part of the blame. Bennett stepped away from the door. "You can leave," he said. "But I'll still submit what I have to the county." Dean gave a small, humorless laugh. "You think the county does not already know winter invoices are messy? I think this one was changed." That ended the attempt at indifference. Dean placed the toolbox on the floor. "The original transport record had 1 page," he said. Bennett did not move. "The invoice? 1 page. Medical transport from the Rourke property to the county clinic. Non-emergency classification, though the weather was poor. The secured service addendum was not attached." "No." Cal stopped working. Dean looked at him. "You said you were not listening." "I said badly." Bennett kept his attention on Dean. "What happened after the transport?" "The finance office reviewed the service code. Warren's finance office. The company office, Dean corrected automatically. The correction sounded like an old habit. They changed the classification from non-emergency medical transportation to special property response under hazardous conditions. What did that do? It added equipment deployment, standby labor, road risk charges, and administrative recovery fees. How much? Dean looked down. Enough to make the original bill almost 4 times larger. Bennett felt anger rise, but he kept his voice level. Did Celia approve the change? Not through dispatch. Did you? I entered the revised code, knowing it was wrong. Dean's jaw tightened. I knew it was aggressive. That is not what I asked. The older man looked toward this workbench, where tools lay in straight rows. I objected. Warren said the driver had used equipment not listed on the original form. He said the route required special clearance. Was that true? I never saw a driver's report supporting it. But you signed the final record. Yes. The word came quietly. Dean pulled the black notebook from his pocket but did not open it. I had worked there 21 years. My pension was 2 years away. My wife had already passed. I told myself I was correcting codes, not taking anyone's property. And when did the addendum appear? Later. How much later? Dean hesitated. The electronic file for the addendum was created more than 3 weeks after Celia signed the transport invoice. Bennett took a slow breath. You saw the timestamp? Yes. And the notary certification? I saw it in the final packet. I do not know who created it or who applied the seal. Did you report the discrepancy? No. Dean's keys made a faint sound as his hand shook. Bennett thought of Celia sitting near the front window with an oxygen cylinder beside her. He thought of the invoice in the desk and Warren's silver pen on the kitchen table. You will need to tell the county what you just told me. Dean's face closed at once. No. You know the document was altered. I know what I saw in an internal system years ago. I do not have access now. You have your memory. Memory is convenient until someone puts it under oath. You kept notes. Dean's hand covered the notebook. They are maintenance dates and dispatch numbers. Then they can be checked. Dean picked up the toolbox again. If this becomes a formal investigation, every report with my name on it will be reviewed. That should happen. Cal turned from the snow vehicle. Easy, Bennett. Bennett looked at him. Cal's expression remained calm. You asked the man why he stayed quiet. He answered. You may not like the answer, but he answered. Dean looked surprised by the defense. Cal was not finished. That does not make him innocent. No, Dean said. It does not. He set the toolbox down a second time, as if the weight had become too much. If I speak, I may lose the pension. I may be charged for signing false reports, and I will have to face every person in Pineglass whose account passed across my desk. Bennett heard the fear beneath the explanation. It was not only fear of Warren. Dean feared becoming visible. Celia had already asked him to do that once. Mabel said Celia came to you, Bennett said. She did. What did she want? Dean looked toward the old tracked snow vehicle. Not what you think. Bennett followed his gaze. The machine sat with one side panel removed, its damaged track loose against the concrete floor. She did not ask me to build a case against Warren, Dean said. She asked me for route schedules. Why? She wanted to know how many homes could be reached before a fuel tank ran dry. She wanted average travel times in heavy snow. She wanted to know which drivers in the village still held commercial licenses. Bennett said nothing. Dean continued. She had already arranged storage space for emergency fuel. Cal had inspected that machine. Mabel had marked the residents who needed medicine or heat checks. Celia was preparing a petition asking the county to restore the old public route across your property as a recognized winter backup road. Bennett looked at the vehicle again. Until that moment, He had treated it as evidence of Celia's resistance to Warren. Dean shook his head. She was not building a case, Bennett. She was building a route. The words changed the room. Bennett had spent the last several days trying to understand who had cornered Celia, who had altered the paperwork, and who could be made to answer for it. Celia had spent her remaining strength asking a different question. How could Pineglass stop being cornered at all? She knew she was dying? Bennett asked. She knew she was getting weaker. Then why not use the time to fight the claim? She said even if Warren lost every contract, another company could come in and do the same thing. Pineglass would still have one road, one supplier, and too few choices. Dean finally opened the black notebook. From between 2 pages, he removed a folded sheet covered in part numbers and mechanical notes. She gave me this list. Cal came closer. Dean handed him the paper. The track tension assembly does not need complete replacement, he said. There is an older drive unit at the county surplus yard. The mounting plate will not match, but the internal wheel and bearing should. Cal studied the numbers. You are sure? I ordered that series when the county still used them. Cal picked up his yellow pencil and began making notes. Bennett watched Dean. You could have brought this a year ago. Yes. Why today? Dean looked at the toolboxes near his feet. I told myself I came for my tools. It was the most honest sentence he had spoken. Bennett could have asked again for a statement. He could have reminded Dean what Celia had suffered while he protected his pension. Instead, Bennett stepped beside the old snow vehicle. What else does it need? Dean looked at him cautiously. You are not going to ask me to testify again? Not today. That does not mean I will. No. Bennett touched the cold metal frame. But you can help Cal tell us whether this machine can run. Dean remained still for several seconds. Then he removed his coat. For the next 3 hours, the men worked around the vehicle. Cal handled the mechanical inspection. Dean checked old serial numbers against the notes in his book. Bennett cleaned corroded fittings, shifted heavy parts when his damaged shoulder allowed, and stopped when Cal told him to stop. Breyer arrived with Mabel near noon. The old German shepherd crossed the garage and settled in her familiar place beside the workbench. Dean watched her lower her silvered muzzle onto her paws. She used to wait there for Celia, he said. Bennett tightened a bolt carefully. Now she waits for me. Mabel brought a folder containing Celia's unfinished petition and a list of residents who had once agreed to participate in a shared winter route. Some names had check marks beside them. Others had notes. Licensed driver, generator, fuel storage, radio experience. Celia had not been waiting for Bennett to return and finish the work for her. She had been asking ordinary people to finish it together. That afternoon, Bennett prepared an initial complaint for the county office, responsible for investigating public contract fraud and improper billing. He attached copies of Celia's invoice, the later addendum, the inconsistent creation dates, and a description of Dean's information without claiming Dean had agreed to testify. Then Mabel began calling the people on Celia's list. The first 2 agreed to meet. The third asked whether Summit Passage would find out. By evening, everyone had an answer. Summit Passage sent notices to several Pineglass households, stating that the company would not renew private fuel delivery agreements with customers participating in an unlicensed competing service. The notice did not affect county emergency response or public snow removal. It targeted the private contracts people depended on to heat their homes. 3 residents withdrew from Celia's route before sunset. Mabel placed the telephone down after the final call. They are afraid. They should be, Bennett said. She looked at him sharply. He folded Celia's list and placed it beside the mechanical notes. Courage is easier when your house is warm. Outside the garage, the western sky had turned a pale iron gray. A weather radio on Cal's bench issued a winter storm watch for the mountain region. Heavy snow was expected within 48 hours. The community vehicle still rested on its damaged track. Dean had gone home without promising to return. Half the people on Celia's list were reconsidering. Bennett stood beside the machine, while Breyer slept near the tools. He had begun the day searching for a witness who could help him defeat Warren. He ended it, understanding that Celia had left him something more difficult than an enemy. She had left unfinished work that could succeed only if people frightened of losing everything chose to depend on one another. The storm reached Pine Glass before dawn, almost 12 hours earlier than the weather service had predicted. By 6 in the morning, snow had erased the lower road and pressed against the windows of the Rourke house in long white sheets. Wind moved through the pines with a deep, steady sound, not like a sudden gust, but like something large breathing across the mountain. Bennett Rourke stood in the kitchen, listening to the emergency radio. A fallen tree and a small snowslide had blocked the main county road below the village. County maintenance crews were clearing the route to the regional hospital first. They would reach Pine Glass when equipment became available. No one could say when that would be. Breyer, Bennett's 11-year-old German shepherd, lay on a rug near the stove. The old dog lifted her head whenever the radio crackled, but she did not rise. Her rear leg had been stiff since the temperature dropped. Bennett filled her water bowl and checked the blanket beneath her. Then Mabel Cross called. "The cooperative garage has power," said the retired rural mail carrier who was organizing communications for the village. "Cal says the machine will start." "That isn't the same as saying it will run." He used stronger language than I'm willing to repeat over the telephone. Bennett pulled on his canvas work jacket. "I'm coming." The Pine Glass Cooperative Garage, the shared repair building near the edge of the village, glowed through the storm like a lantern behind frosted glass. Inside, the old tracked snow vehicle shook beneath the overhead lights. Cal Mercer, Pine Glass's year-round mechanic, sat behind the controls while the engine idled unevenly. His gray mustache moved as he muttered at the gauges. The vehicle had once belonged to the county. Its faded yellow body carried scratches, rust, and parts from 3 different equipment models. One track had been rebuilt from the old assembly Dean Hollis had identified. The replacement wheel fit, but only after Cal manufactured a new mounting plate by hand. Bennett climbed onto the side step. "How bad?" Cal tapped the temperature gauge. "The engine runs hot. The repaired drive assembly cannot take speed. If you push it like a modern plow, it will stop being a vehicle and become an expensive shed. So we go slowly. We go slowly. We stop often, and no one calls this a rescue machine." Mabel stood near a folding table covered with maps, radio equipment, and Celia's unfinished route notes. She wore a headset over her cream-knit cap and had divided the village into 3 sections. 2 residents with small 4-wheel-drive vehicles would follow the cleared path. One carried medicine and bottled water. The other carried heating fuel in approved containers. Several people had agreed to check homes on foot where the distance was short and safe. Not everyone had returned after Warren Cade's warnings, but enough had. Bennett studied the map. "We clear the lower homes first, then the road past the cafe. No one enters the eastern ridge until we confirm the slope is stable." Cal pointed a grease-stained finger at him. "You are not driving." "I know." "You also are not lifting anything heavy with that left arm." "I know." Mabel glanced between them. "I enjoy seeing someone else give Bennett orders." Bennett ignored her. He had commanded trained teams in conditions worse than this, but he no longer knew every turn of Pine Glass. He did not know which culvert had collapsed 2 winters earlier, or where drifting snow hid the edge of the road. Celia's plan worked only if no one person pretended to know everything. Cal drove. Bennett took the observer's position beside him, watching for buried fence posts, broken branches, and changes in the road surface. Mabel remained at the garage and kept contact with each household. The old machine moved into the storm shortly after 7. Its blade pushed only a narrow path. Cal refused to take deep cuts, backing away whenever the engine temperature rose. Bennett marked hazards with orange poles, so the smaller vehicles behind them would know where not to turn. The work was slow. At the first isolated house, they found an elderly resident standing inside her doorway with a coat over her nightclothes. Her furnace still worked, but her medicine had been due the previous afternoon. A driver from the volunteer team brought the package inside. At the next property, snow had blocked the outdoor exhaust vent of a generator. Bennett cleared it with a shovel while Cal watched the vehicle's gauges. No one applauded. No one needed to. A porch light came on behind them as they moved to the next house, then another. Each light meant someone had heat, medicine, or a cleared path to a neighbor. The route was working. Not smoothly, not quickly, but it was working. Near the village square, a radio call came from Mabel. "Summit Passage has reported 2 plows out of service," she said. "The third is operating beyond the western ridge." Summit Passage, Warren Cade's private snow removal and fuel company, still held a county contract for several secondary roads around Pineglass. Warren had not openly refused public work. He had simply placed his remaining vehicle on a more profitable commercial route. "Has the county been informed?" Bennett asked. "Yes, they recorded it." "Then we keep moving." Cal glanced sideways. "You expected Warren to come racing up the hill?" "No." "Good. Disappointment wastes fuel." By late morning, the old machine had cleared a usable corridor through the center of Pineglass. The smaller vehicles had delivered medicine to 4 homes and emergency fuel to 2 others. Bennett's shoulder had begun to ache. He changed positions often and let other residents handle work he would once have taken without asking. That was harder than the cold. At noon, they returned to the cooperative garage to cool the engine. Breyer was waiting inside with Mabel. The old German shepherd lay near the heated wall, where the concrete remained warm. She raised her head when Bennett entered, then rested it again when she saw him walking normally. Mabel handed him a cup of coffee. "We have one problem." "Only one?" "Dean Hollis has not checked in." Dean, the former Summit Passage dispatcher, who had helped identify the altered service records, lived alone near the old radio relay station on the eastern ridge. Bennett looked toward the map. "When did anyone last hear from him?" "Just before sunrise. He told Cal he was going to inspect the relay equipment." The old relay station was a small technical site above Pineglass. Celia had planned to use its radio repeater to extend emergency communication across the mountain. The equipment had been unreliable for years. "Why would Dean go up there today?" Bennett asked. Cal removed his gloves. "Because a man has spent a year avoiding useful decisions and apparently chose this morning to correct the habit." "Did he take a radio?" "A handheld unit. We cannot reach it." Mabel marked Dean's home and the relay station on the map. One of the volunteer drivers had already checked his house. The station wagon was gone. Bennett studied Celia's notes. Several route names no longer matched current road signs. A logging path had been renamed. Another trail had disappeared from county maps after a washout. Breyer rose from the warm wall. The old dog walked to the side door and stood facing it. Mabel watched her. "What is beyond that door?" Bennett asked. "The old pine trail." "Does it reach the relay station?" "Not directly. It climbs behind the eastern ridge." Breyer pressed her nose near the gap beneath the door, then looked back toward Mabel. The dog had traveled that route with Celia years earlier, when the 2 of them delivered food and checked the relay building after storms. Bennett crouched beside her. "You remember the trail." Breyer's ears shifted toward his voice. He did not mistake memory for a command. He did not put a leash on her or ask an old dog with an injured leg to enter a blizzard. Bennett rested one hand on her neck. "You stay here." Breyer leaned into his palm. Mabel traced the old pine trail on Celia's map. If they followed this line, it would bring them above the sharp turn, where Dean's Road usually drifts shut. Cal studied the elevation marks. We can clear the lower section with the tracked vehicle. After that, the slope is too narrow. Then we go on foot from there, Bennett said. Cal shook his head. You and one other person. Not a crowd. Bennett selected a volunteer who knew the eastern ridge and carried winter medical supplies. Cal remained with the machine, ready to move it if the road shifted. They found Dean's station wagon 40 minutes later. It sat at an angle near a snow-covered turn. The driver's door was closed. The engine was cold. No one was inside. Footprints led away from the road, but wind had already softened their edges. Bennett used Celia's map, Mabel's directions over the radio, and the dark line of trees marking the old pine trail. He did not follow the footprints blindly. He checked the slope, the wind direction, and every break in the snow where the ground might fall away. The relay station appeared through the storm as a low concrete building beside a narrow metal tower. The door was partly open. Dean sat on the floor inside. His face was pale, and his right boot had been removed. One ankle had swollen after he slipped near the entrance. He had wrapped it with a scarf and pulled an equipment cover around his shoulders. The radio repeater beside him gave off a faint green light. You fixed it, Bennett said. Dean managed a tired expression. Partly. Can you stand? Not usefully. Bennett checked his condition without dramatizing it. Dean was cold and exhausted, but alert. The ankle appeared badly twisted rather than broken. The volunteer prepared a warm wrap and helped secure the injured leg. Dean looked toward Bennett. You came for me. We noticed you were missing. I thought the signal would help. It will. Dean's eyes dropped. I should have told someone where I was going. Yes. Bennett did not add anything else. They moved Dean on a compact rescue sled kept at the station for maintenance emergencies. The descent was slow. Bennett's shoulder protested each time he stabilized the line, forcing him to let the second man carry more of the load. He accepted the help. When they reached the tracked vehicle, Cal opened the side door. You picked an excellent day to become responsible, he told Dean. Dean gave a weak laugh. Back at the cooperative garage, Mabel wrapped him in blankets and placed warm water in his hands. Breyer approached slowly, sniffed Dean's coat, and lay nearby without touching him. No one asked about Summit Passage. No one asked for his notebook. For the rest of the day, the community vehicle returned to the cleared corridor. The repaired radio repeater allowed Mabel to contact homes that had previously fallen outside the handheld radio's range. By evening, every occupied house in Pine Glass had been checked. The old snow vehicle had overheated twice, stalled once, and completed the route anyway. Celia's plan had survived its first storm. 3 days later, after Dean's ankle had been examined and he could move with crutches, he asked Bennett to drive him to the county office. Dean carried the black dispatch notebook he had protected for years. He also brought copies of vehicle schedules, fuel receipts, service codes, and billing summaries taken before he left Summit Passage. I kept telling myself these were insurance, he said during the drive. Against Warren? Against admitting I had helped him. At the county office, Dean requested to speak with the investigator handling Bennett's complaint. He did not ask what he would receive in return. The records showed a pattern larger than Celia's account. Summit Passage had billed for trips with no matching vehicle logs. It had added emergency charges during ordinary weather. In several cases, private deliveries had been delayed until customers missed contract deadlines and accepted new terms. Dean's documents did not complete the investigation, but they changed its size. That evening, Bennett returned to the cooperative garage. The old tracked vehicle stood beneath the lights, its engine silent, and its rebuilt track still marked by the storm. Breyer rested in her familiar place beside the workbench. Cal was cleaning tools. Mabel was updating the list of residents who had agreed to remain part of the winter route. The system was still fragile. One machine could fail. Volunteers could leave. The county could refuse support. Yet Pine Glass had opened its own road before anyone arrived to save it. Bennett looked at Celia's map pinned to the wall. For years, he had survived by believing he was fighting his way back to one person. Now the work Celia left behind was teaching him something harder. Home was not only the place where someone waited for him, it was also the place where people learned to reach one another. 3 days after the storm, Bennett Rourke sat across from Nora Bell in a small county records room filled with file boxes and humming fluorescent lights. Nora Bell, the 47-year-old investigator assigned to contract fraud and public service billing, had short black curls with a natural silver streak above her right temple. She wore a charcoal jacket over a dark burgundy sweater and spoke with the calm precision of someone who did not confuse urgency with haste. On the table between them lay Dean Hollis's dispatch notebook, copies of Summit Passage vehicle schedules, fuel receipts, customer invoices, and the disputed property filing connected to the Rourke home. Dean sat at one end of the table with his injured ankle supported on a second chair. The former Summit Passage dispatcher had answered Nora's questions for nearly 2 hours without asking for protection from the consequences. Bennett respected that. Nora placed 2 pages side by side. "This invoice bills Summit Passage for a delivery during severe weather," she said, "but the county weather station recorded clear roads and light wind that day." She moved to another record. "This customer was charged for a vehicle deployment. There is no matching engine log, driver assignment, or fuel use." Dean looked at the documents. "That happened more than once." "I know," Nora said. "Your notebook helped us identify the pattern." She turned to Celia Rourke's medical transport record. "The original invoice was created on January 9th. The secured service addendum was created 23 days later." Bennett looked at the second page. "And the certification?" "The notary whose seal appears on the addendum was not working on the date listed. We have not yet determined who applied the seal or who ordered the page attached." "Is that enough to stop Warren?" "It is enough to continue the investigation." "That was not my question." Nora met his gaze. "No, it is not yet enough to arrest Warren Cade or prove that he personally altered the document." The answer struck Bennett's patience, but not his judgment. Nora continued before he could respond. "What we have is stronger than it was last week. We have inconsistent file dates, unsupported charges, altered service codes, and public contract expenses mixed with private customer billing. We also have evidence that Summit Passage used disputed property claims to pressure customers before any court confirmed those claims." Dean folded his hands. "What happens now?" "We preserve the company records. We identify who created the files. Then the county attorney and prosecutor decide what actions the evidence supports." Bennett looked through the narrow window. Snow still covered the parking lot in bright ridges left by the plows. Meanwhile, Warren keeps operating. Not without limits. Nora explained that the county procurement office was reviewing Summit Passage's road-clearing contract. The storm had already raised questions about why the company's remaining vehicle had been assigned to a commercial route, while public roads under contract went unserved. If the county finds immediate risk to public service or records, she said, it can suspend the contract while the audit continues. "Can you tell people what you found?" "I can state that the audit identified serious irregularities. I cannot declare anyone guilty at a village meeting." Bennett turned toward her. "What village meeting?" Dean looked away. Nora closed one of the folders. "Warren Cade announced it this morning." That evening, Pine Glass residents filled the Pine Glass Community Hall, a cedar-sided building normally used for town dinners, winter supply drives, and public meetings. Rows of folding chairs faced a low wooden platform. Wet coats hung along the back wall. The room smelled of coffee, melting snow, and the old floor polish Mabel Cross had used for years. Bennett sat near the aisle with Briar lying beside his chair. The elderly German shepherd had recovered some strength since the storm, but her rear legs still stiffened after long walks. Bennett had spread a folded blanket beneath her, so she would not have to lie directly on the cold floor. Mabel sat on Bennett's other side, with Celia's route map rolled beneath her chair. Cal Mercer stood near the wall, arms folded across his broad chest. The village mechanic had changed out of his work coveralls, but still had a yellow pencil tucked behind one ear. Dean sat in the second row with a cane beside his injured foot. No one looked comfortable. That was probably why Warren had chosen the hall. The owner of Summit Passage stood at the front wearing a dark navy suit beneath his charcoal winter coat. His black scarf had been folded neatly on the table beside him. A stack of printed statements rested near his familiar silver pen. Warren waited until the room quieted. Pine Glass has survived difficult winters. Because local businesses accepted risks larger companies would not take, he began. His voice carried easily without becoming loud. He spoke about fuel prices, vehicle repairs, insurance, mountain roads, and the expense of keeping trained drivers available. He admitted there may have been billing mistakes. Mistakes are not fraud, he said, and disagreement is not exploitation. Several residents shifted in their chairs. Warren continued. He described Summit Passage as the only company with the equipment, staff, and regional contacts to serve Pine Glass through a severe winter. The community snow vehicle, he said, had completed one emergency route under unusual conditions. That does not make it a reliable service, he added. Good intentions do not replace licenses, insurance, maintenance schedules, or accountability. Cal murmured from the wall. That is the first sensible thing he has said. Mabel gave him a warning glance. Warren then turned to Celia. Mrs. Rourke was deeply concerned for this community. No one disputes that. But during her final illness, she was under physical strain and emotional distress. Some people encouraged her to pursue projects that were neither financially nor medically realistic. Bennett's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Warren looked directly at him. And now, her husband has returned, after nearly 6 years. The room became very still. Mr. Rourke served his country, Warren said. That deserves respect, but respect does not make him an expert on events he did not witness. Bennett rose. Breyer lifted her head. Warren did not stop. A man who was not present during his wife's illness should be careful before accusing those who remained here of failing her. The words found the exact place Warren intended. For one sharp moment, Bennett no longer saw the community hall. He saw Celia alone beside the front window. He saw the empty oxygen cylinder, the medicine tray, and the date on her grave. He felt every mile between the hospital where he woke under his own name and the cemetery he reached too late. He stepped into the aisle. Several people leaned back. They knew Bennett had once been a Navy SEAL. They knew what kind of man he had been trained to become when restraint failed. Breyer rose slowly from the blanket. The old dog did not bark or stand between Bennett and Warren. She walked one step forward and placed her silvered muzzle beneath Bennett's hand. His fingers closed gently over the side of her face. Breyer remained there. The contact did not erase Bennett's anger. It gave the anger somewhere to stop. He looked down at the dog that had waited through the same years and lost the same woman. Then he faced the room. Warren is right about one thing, Bennett said. The owner of Summit Passage raised his chin slightly. I was not here. Bennett's voice remained steady. I wasn't here when Celia became ill. I was not here when she needed help carrying fuel, reaching the clinic, or getting through the night. My absence left work for other people. It left fear. It left room for men who knew how to use both. No one moved. But my absence does not turn a false charge into a real one. It does not make a page, created 3 weeks later, part of the document my wife signed. It does not make a public road private. And it does not give anyone the right to call sick people confused whenever they refused to surrender something valuable. Warren's expression hardened. Bennett could have kept speaking. Instead, he returned to his chair. He sat beside Briar and placed one hand on her back. The silence that followed did not belong to Warren anymore. Mabel stood first. She told the room how Celia had tracked medicine deliveries and fuel shortages during her final winters. She described the days Summit Passage delayed private service while continuing to add fees. She was sick, Mabel said. She was also capable of understanding the word no. Then Ruth Danner, the owner of the Blue Lantern Cafe, displayed the photograph of her original one-page generator agreement and the later three-page version sent by Summit Passage. Edith Lyle, the 72-year-old widow from the Lower Road, held up the fuel invoice that had nearly tripled after delivery. Cal explained how the nearest parts supplier had begun delaying pine glass orders after Summit Passage purchased it. "I cannot prove why," he said. "I can prove what was ordered, what was charged, and what never arrived." Finally, Dean stood. His cane shook once against the wooden floor. "I signed reports I knew were unsupported," he said. "I changed service codes after the work was completed. I told myself I was protecting my job." Warren spoke from the platform. "You should consult an attorney before making statements that expose you to liability." Dean looked at him. "I should have consulted my conscience before I signed them." No one applauded. The confession was too serious for that. Nora Bell rose from the rear of the hall, where she had been observing without interrupting. She identified herself as the county investigator overseeing the preliminary audit. Then she stated only what her office could support. The audit had found billing entries without matching vehicle records. Several contract additions had been created after the dates of the original customer signatures. Public and private charges had been improperly combined. The certification attached to Celia's property document was under formal review. "These findings are not a final judgment," Nora said, "but they are serious enough that the county has temporarily suspended Summit Passage's secondary road contract while records are secured and reviewed." A low sound moved through the room. Not celebration. Relief mixed with disbelief. Warren gathered his papers. "This community will regret replacing professional service with emotion." "No one said we were replacing the county," Mabel replied. "We are replacing helplessness." Warren placed the silver pen inside his coat. He stepped down from the platform and walked toward the exit. No one blocked him. No one insulted him. The residents nearest the aisle simply remained where they were. For years, people had moved aside when Warren entered a room. That night, they made him find his own way through. The following morning, the county attorney obtained a temporary court order requiring Summit Passage to preserve financial and electronic records. The order also froze transfers from accounts tied to the disputed contracts and paused enforcement of the property claim against the Rourke land. Warren had not been convicted. The investigation was not finished, but he could no longer use the unresolved claim to force Bennett or other residents into new agreements while the evidence was being examined. By evening, lights remained on laid across pine glass. Coffee appeared in the community garage. Someone brought a pie to Mabel's house. Cal claimed the old tracked vehicle deserved a name and rejected every suggestion offered. Bennett did not stay. He walked home with Briar beneath a clear winter sky. Inside the Rourke house, he removed his coat and entered the kitchen. Celia's pale blue cup still stood beside his dark green one in the cupboard. This time, he took both down. He filled only one. Briar settled near the stove while Bennett sat at the table where Warren had once placed the access agreement. The unsigned papers were gone. The property claim had been paused. Celia's name had been defended by people who had known her after Bennett disappeared. He should have felt victorious. Instead, the empty cup across from him remained empty. Bennett rested his palm against its chipped handle. Stopping Warren could protect the road. It could protect the house. It could not give Bennett the one thing he had crossed 6 lost years to recover. He had returned alive. Celia would never hear him say it. The last weeks of winter passed slowly over Pine Glass, the remote mountain village, where Bennett Rourke had finally stopped waiting for one clear moment called justice. There was no single morning when everything became right. Instead, change arrived through telephone calls, court notices, corrected records, and envelopes carried up the mountain by county vehicles. The county prosecutor's office filed formal charges against Warren Cade, the owner of Summit Passage, and a financial employee who had helped prepare several disputed service records. The charges included contract fraud, use of altered documents, false service reporting, and an attempt to obtain property interests through misleading financial claims. Warren denied wrongdoing. His attorneys argued that the company's accounting system had been poorly managed rather than deliberately misused. They blamed clerical mistakes, harsh weather, and employees who had failed to follow policy. The final judgment would take time, but the claim against the Rourke property did not. A county court reviewed the original medical transport invoice, the later addendum, the electronic creation dates, and the invalid certification. The judge ruled that Celia Rourke had not signed or legally approved the document that placed an interest against the family's access road. The disputed claim was canceled. Because Bennett had never been declared legally dead, the Rourke house had remained jointly owned during his absence. Under the form of ownership Bennett and Celia had chosen years earlier, Celia's share passed to him after the remaining estate matters were completed. The house was his again. The news did not feel the way Bennett had imagined victory should feel. He stood outside the county office with the court papers folded inside his coat. Snowmelt dripped from the roof above him. Cars moved along the street. Somewhere nearby, a delivery truck released its brakes with a long hiss. Bennett read the final sentence once more. The property was clear. Celia was still gone. He returned to Pine Glass before dark. Briar, his 11-year-old German shepherd, met him at the front door. The old dog had gained weight since Bennett found her wandering beside the mountain road. Her black and honey coat looked fuller, and the pale marks above her eyes no longer stood out against a hollow face. Age had not reversed. Her left rear leg remained stiff in cold weather. She needed more time to rise after sleeping, and she avoided slick floors whenever possible. Bennett had placed long woven rugs through the hallway and kitchen so she could move without slipping. He had also built a low wooden step beside the porch because Briar could no longer climb the old stairs comfortably. She sniffed the papers inside his coat, then looked up at him. "It's ours," Bennett said. Briar turned toward the kitchen. She did not understand property law. She understood that Bennett had returned before supper. That was enough for her. Justice moved through the rest of Pine Glass in similarly ordinary ways. Some residents received partial refunds from accounts frozen during the investigation. Others had disputed service fees removed from their records. Several property claims were suspended, while courts reviewed whether the supporting contracts were valid. Not every loss could be undone. One family's land had already been sold to an outside buyer who claimed no knowledge of the original dispute. Recovering it would require another lawsuit. A workshop taken through a chain of debt agreements could not simply be handed back without reviewing the rights of its current owner. Dean Hollis, the former Summit Passage dispatcher, who had turned over his private records, accepted responsibility for the reports he had signed. The county did not treat him as an innocent observer. Dean lost part of his retirement benefit and agreed to cooperate fully with the remaining cases. For several months, he could not enter the Blue Lantern Cafe without feeling people notice him. Some residents thanked him for finally speaking. Others were not ready. Dean did not ask them to be. He began spending several mornings each week at the Pine Glass Cooperative Garage, where the community's old tracked snow vehicle was stored. He built a new dispatch board that recorded every trip, driver, delivery, and fuel charge in handwriting, large enough for anyone to read. Nothing could be added later without leaving an obvious mark. "This would have prevented half of it," Dean said one morning. Cal Mercer, the village mechanic responsible for keeping the old machine running, shook his head. "No board prevents dishonesty." Dean looked down. Cal tapped the wooden frame with his yellow pencil. "But it makes honesty easier to check." That was as close to forgiveness as either man tried to come. Bennett spent much of February deciding whether to leave Pine Glass. He contacted a real estate agent in a town beyond the mountain. He asked what the Rourke house might bring if the access dispute remained settled. The answer was more than enough for a smaller home somewhere, without Celia's chair near the window, without her coat hooks by the door, and without a road she had watched for 6 years. Bennett imagined driving away with Briar beside him. The image brought no relief. It only gave his grief a different landscape. One afternoon, he began packing Celia's belongings. He started with the front bedroom, working carefully rather than quickly. He placed medical supplies in one box for the county clinic. Warm clothing went into another for the winter pantry. Books were divided between the village library and the people whose names Celia had written inside the covers. Every object required a decision. A person could spend years surviving impossible conditions and still be defeated by a cardigan that carried the shape of someone's shoulders. Bennett sat on the edge of the bed, holding Celia's silver pine branch brooch. Briar entered the room and stopped near the doorway. The old dog did not approach the boxes. She looked from Bennett to the empty section of the closet where Celia's coats had hung. Bennett closed his hand around the small piece of silver. "I don't know what staying means," he said. Briar lowered herself onto the rug. He had once believed leaving the house would mean abandoning Celia for a second time. Then he feared staying would turn the place into a monument where nothing living was allowed to change. Both thoughts placed Celia in the past and Bennett outside the rest of his own life. A radio call sounded from the front room. Mabel Cross, the retired rural mail carrier now managing the community winter schedule, was asking whether the Rourke house could store 2 emergency heaters until the cooperative garage had more space. Bennett looked toward the open door. Celia's home did not need to remain untouched to remain hers. It needed a purpose that was still alive. He carried the first box downstairs. Over the following weeks, the room facing the road changed. Bennett removed the heavy curtains and repaired the draft around the windows. Cal helped install shelves for radios, batteries, blankets, and medical kits. Mabel brought county maps and mounted them on the wall beside Celia's original route notes. The room became a small emergency communication and warming station for Pine Glass. The shed behind the house was cleared of broken furniture and fitted with secure cabinets for tools, fuel containers, and road markers. A backup generator was placed on a raised concrete platform where snowmelt could not reach it. The work did not erase Celia. Her handwriting remained on the route map. Her blue-gray chair stayed near the front window, not as an object no one could touch, but as the place where Mabel sat during long radio shifts. Bennett worked with county officials and a local land attorney to create a permanent community access agreement across the edge of the Rourke property. The agreement did not give the road to a business or one private owner. It placed the winter route under a non-profit cooperative managed by Pine Glass residents and reviewed by the county. No single person could close it. No single company could use it as leverage. Cal accepted responsibility for vehicle maintenance. Mabel organized communication schedules. Dean designed a dispatch system that allowed every member to review the records. Bennett agreed to coordinate training and safety, but he refused the title of director. "Celia already tried to teach us not to build this around one person," he said. By early March, sunlight remained on the mountain later each afternoon. Snow still covered the higher slopes, but water began running beneath the edges of the road. Briar improved with the warmer days. Bennett took her on short walks, never farther than her legs could manage. When large diesel vehicles passed, She sometimes pressed close to him. He did not pull her forward or command her to ignore the fear. He stopped with her. He let the sound pass. Then they continued when she was ready. Healing, Bennett learned, was not proof that fear had disappeared. Sometimes it was simply the freedom to pause without being left behind. One bright afternoon, Bennett came outside carrying a box of radio batteries. Briar was standing near the entrance to the property. It was the same place where Celia had once watched the mountain road, the same place Briar had returned to after the funeral, the same direction the old dog had been facing when Bennett found her wandering in the snow. Bennett placed the box on the porch. He did not call her. Briar stood with her silvered muzzle lifted toward the road. A light wind moved through the honey-colored fur along her chest. For a moment, Bennett felt the old hope return in its most painful form. Perhaps they were both still waiting, not for a vehicle, not for a miracle, for the world to admit that one person was missing and correct the mistake. The road remained empty. Briar looked back at Bennett. He stayed where he was. The old German shepherd turned away from the mountain road. She crossed the yard slowly, favoring her left rear leg. Bennett watched her approach the porch, climb the low step he had built, and settle beside his boots. He sat down next to her. Below the house, the lights of the pine glass winter route came on one by one. The old tracked vehicle left the cooperative garage for its evening inspection, moving slowly but steadily along the road Celia had protected. Mabel's voice came through the radio inside the front room. "Rourke Station, radio check." Bennett reached through the open window and picked up the handset. "Rourke Station hears you. Road team is moving. I can see them." Briar rested her head against his boot. Justice had protected this house. It had cleared Celia's name and given other families a chance to challenge what had happened to them. It had not returned the 6 years Bennett lost. It had not given Celia one final morning, one final conversation, or the chance to hear that her husband had survived. Briar could not replace her. The old dog's loyalty was not a cure, and the work of pine glass was not payment for Bennett's grief. But there was life in the house again. There was a dog beside him who needed warmth, patience, and another walk tomorrow. There were radios sounding in the front room and neighbors using the road Celia had refused to surrender. Love did not always save what people wanted most. Sometimes it left behind a road, a faithful old dog, and just enough light for the person who remained to take the next step. Sometimes peace does not come because everything we lost is returned. It comes when we learn to carry love forward in a new way. Bennett could not bring Celia home, and Briar could not erase the years of waiting. But together, they kept her kindness alive by opening a road that would help others find warmth, safety, and one another. In our own lives, healing may begin with something small. Staying beside someone who is afraid, choosing not to answer pain with anger, or using what remains to serve another person. May God give you peace for what cannot be changed, and courage for the good that can still be done. Please share what this story meant to you in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to hear more stories of loyalty, hope, and quiet strength.